Frost, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here into this Aremo world, which we're covering for the first or second time. We're going to be looking very closely today at the Defra consultation on biodiversity. As many of you will know, this opened in January and closes in just over a fortnight's time. So it's a crucial, I think, meeting to discover just what is involved and what it will mean for your respective industries. Now, we have the benefit of some expert speakers to guide us through. We have with us Richard Broadbent, Julia Baker, John Davis, and Indranil Ghosh. And they will be speaking to give us in turn an overview, an industry perspective, a look at what the building blocks are for biodiversity, and also what this means for investment and funding going forward. I urge you all to take this opportunity in and also put your thoughts to questions to them, which they will answer. Each of them will be speaking for a short while, and while that's going on, you can put some questions to them on the chat, which we're going to explain now in full glory. So we'll move through this session. So there's a little bit of housekeeping, some social media guidance, and please feel free to share your thoughts on social media. The handle is RSK Group, but even more crucially, the hashtag is Route to COP15. So Route to COP15 for any platforms you may wish to share. We're currently in present mode. So at the moment, that means your microphones and cameras will all be automatically turned off. During the presentation from each of our speakers, you can pose questions to them, which we will hope to get to depending on how long they talk for. There'll be a couple of minutes for Q&A after each presentation, and then another Q&A session at the end of the afternoon, which we'll get to. That time is very tight, lots of information to share, so bear with us. And each of our speakers have also said that if you do pose a question that they don't get to, they will be happy to correspond with you direct, so it's not wasted. Also, you can vote. If you see the questions in the chat on the Q&A, you can see if there are any favourite questions that you do support being asked, then just vote for it and it will bump to the top and become one of the most popular ones, and we'll make sure we get to those ones. Couple more things. After the webinar, there's a short survey. You'll receive a link, so feel free to take a few minutes for good and for bad feedback so that all the webinars can be improved and tailored to your needs. That's the key point. And also there's going to be an article on the RSK website reporting on everything that has gone on today, so including your own contributions. They are currently, I mean, the default is that they'll be anonymous, so do feel free to chip in. But if they do want to borrow any quotes or these thoughts, they'll be asking your permission in advance. So feel free to speak freely. Right, Aremo, here we go. So microphones and cameras currently going off and staying off while the speakers are presenting. The speakers slide, now this was crucial for me when I was going through this. As you can see, there's a little box top right. This is your button to expand the slides, to expand to fill the whole screen while they're speaking. I hope that helps you, certainly helped me. Questions, keep them coming via the chat button over on the bottom of your bar, and then you'll see it pop up on the right hand side, and the Q&A you want to go for any questions that you want to pose to the speakers. And as I said, you can vote for your favorites as well. Right, event format, 30 minutes for speakers, and then 25 minutes breakout session where you'll be going to your tables, virtual theme tables, and you can double click any empty seat that you wish to join. There are themed tables, discovered them already, residential development, commercial development, construction, transport infrastructure, and water and energy. So a maximum of 8 seats per table, but if a table's full, just jump to the next most appropriate table for your needs. And as we said, the discussion afterwards will be completely wide open, so hopefully you won't miss out on any key part of this discussion. The purpose of the breakout session is to allow you to discuss with your peers your thoughts, your challenges, the opportunities that you see ahead of you, and particularly pertaining to your sector and area of work. There will be event assistants on each of these tables gathering your thoughts and comments as well. Plenty of help for you to navigate all of this. And then finally, put all those thoughts together and we'll have a big free-for-all with the speakers participating and chipping in as much as possible, and even more of a Q&A afterwards where I this opportunity to have the advantage of this expert insight that we have with us today. So first of all, we'll start with Richard Broadbent, who is our first speaker. If I could ask Richard to join the stage and turn his camera and microphone on, is what I mean in this virtual world. Richard is the director of the Planning and Environment Group of Freeths. He is a highly distinguished environmental lawyer, and he's going to be here to give us an overview on the consultation and what it means for business.
Great. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you all today, and I'll be giving you an overview of the law for biodiversity net gain. First slide, please. All right, next slide. So by way of context, the UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. The UK only has half of its entire biodiversity left, and there are some shocking statistics about that on the slide. And so given this horrific backdrop of biodiversity declines in this country, the government has been roused into action. And in its 25-year environment plan, it says one of the ways it's going to do that is its current policy is that the planning system should provide biodiversity net gains where possible. So no net loss, but net gains. We will explore strengthening this requirement for planning authorities to ensure environmental net gains across their areas, and will consult on making this mandatory. Next slide, please. So, what is biodiversity net gain? This photograph here gives you a feel for what on-site biodiversity net gain might look like for a development. Next slide, please. So the first thing to note is that biodiversity net gain is not yet mandatory. However, it is currently promoted in the government's NPPF on planning under paragraph 174. You can see the quote there. And it's often referred to in local plans as well. So for some of you out there, it may already feel like this is something you already have to deal with. Next slide, please. So after a hugely long gestation period, the Environment Act became law in November 2021. And the Act contains provisions which will implement biodiversity net gain. It will not become mandatory until 2023, we think in November 2023. And when it becomes mandatory, it'll do this by including new provisions into the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. It'll also, in due course, become mandatory for nationally significant infrastructure projects under the Planning Act 2008. And the 2022 consultation refers to that happening in November 2025, so a bit after the Town and Country Planning Act. The Act gives us very little detail. Even the 109-page consultation leaves us with more questions than answers. And much of that will come forward through secondary legislation. That's what we're expecting. And that will come after the consultation, obviously. Next slide, please. So what will the new mandatory biodiversity net gain obligations be? Well, it'll be a minimum of 10% net gain. That's what the consultation says. However, local planning authorities can request more than 10%. And developers obviously may wish to offer more than 10%. Next slide, please. So the mechanisms for this, for the delivery of that minimum 10% net gain will be general planning conditions, worded as shown on the slide. You can see the wording for it there, slightly different for each one. You can see the reference to a net gain plan that has to be submitted. Next slide, please. So, what is a net gain plan? What does that mean? Well, that will show the 10% gain between the pre-development biodiversity value of on-site habitats and the biodiversity value now attributable to the development. So, but watch out, that 10% figure may change over time. There's provisions to change that. Also, you can't scorch the earth now ahead of that November 2023 mandatory starting point. The value of the land will take into account any activities that have taken place on the land after the 30th of January 2020. And that's the date that the bill was first introduced to Parliament. Next slide, please. So the way that biodiversity is valued is in biodiversity units, and that's calculated in accordance with the biodiversity metric version 3.0 created by Natural England. And the whole scheme really lives or dies by how effective that metric is in creating a fungibility for biodiversity units, which is accepted and also which delivers in reality. And that metric, as you can imagine, has a great many critics. So not everyone has bought into this idea, but that's the metric that's being used. Next slide, please. So how do you calculate the biodiversity value attributable to the development? That's the second part of the biodiversity net gain plan. Well, that's comprised of three elements. First is the post-development biodiversity value, of the on-site habitat. So what you're doing on-site. Then it's the biodiversity value of any registered off-site biodiversity gain. So that's where you use registered sites off-site. And then the third part is any value from purchased statutory biodiversity credits. But please note that whilst biodiversity credits can be purchased, they will be made deliberately expensive in order to encourage reliance on registered off-site biodiversity gain. But the presence of those credits in the system means that developments will not risk being rejected because developers can't actually deliver the net gain. They will just have to deliver it through the credits, but they are disincentivized. Next slide, please. So habitat enhancements must be legally secured for 30 years from the completion of the development. And that can be done via a condition in the planning permission, an obligation, so section 106 obligation, planning obligation with a local planning authority, or via the new conservation covenants, which is a new tool introduced under the Environment Act, which will allows positive and negative covenants to bind the land in perpetuity. So that might become the medium through which this operates in practice. Next slide, please. Finally, given the current lack of detail, there's still a great deal of uncertainty and debate over how biodiversity net gain will operate. The vital issue really is enforcement and compliance. But in addition to that, there's two areas which often come up when I speak with my clients about this, and are topics of debate which I know the UK Environmental Law Association is wrestling with. And that's stacking, that's using one piece of land for multiple purposes, and additionality, where net gain delivers something additional to commitments which the government already has or other public bodies already have to conserve and enhance biodiversity. And those are themes that other panel members will touch on in their presentations. Great, thank you for your time. Happy to take your questions now.
A very interesting opening for the session. I have for you at the moment, before we proceed, which is, it's a biggie though, it's how you envisage when this, as you say, it's not legislation yet, it's advised, and I love it, it's deliberately vague, but once it is legislation, how do you see that being enforced?
Well, it'll be through these conditions, which will be imposed into all new development. So that's how it will have its mandatory bite, its teeth. First of all, under the Town and Country Planning Act, and then later for NSIPs under the Planning Act 2008. So that's how it will happen. And then in the meantime, what's happening is Natural England is creating the infrastructure which this will operate through. So the register for biodiversity, the credits, and so on, and how that will operate. Okay,
so not yet too draconian at this stage.
No, but some of my clients are already dealing with it. It's coming through in policy terms. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've got a little sneaky questions just come in. Much of our work is done under permitted development rights. Impact here.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's dealt with within the consultation. I can give you a detailed answer to that later.
You might have to pick that one up.
Yeah.
Fine, that's all right. See, already one in the drawer. Okay, so many thank you to you for beginning our discussion this afternoon. May I now ask Julia Baker to take to the stage, turn on her camera and microphone, please, Julia. Thank you. So Julia is a Balfour BT, technical specialist in biodiversity. She's also an academic, a researcher, visiting researcher at Oxford University, and the lead author of the UK's Biodiversity Net Gain Good Practice Principles for Development. So we couldn't really have anyone better to talk to us about biodiversity and what it means practically speaking. So Julia, please give us your perspective.
Yes, and good afternoon, everyone. If I could go to the next slide, please. So I work with clients who are really interested in biodiversity net gain and the benefits that it brings to their business. And I work with clients whose priorities are development, but they want to know what the new mandatory approach to biodiversity might mean for them. Now, while my clients differ in their opinion about biodiversity net gain, the one thing they have in common is that they don't like risk, and they don't like uncertainties, and they don't like question marks. And it very much echoes what Richard was saying. So my first point to Defra, as they go through the consultations, and they will get so many different responses and different opinions, and they'll have to wade through that. My point is clarity. Now, they won't be able to please absolutely everyone when they come with the secondary legislation, but they won't please anyone if it's unclear, if there's a lack of strength of voice. So it's clarity in the policy that's most important. We need to know what the ask is. When you're kind of stumbling around from a practitioner's point of view, you need that clarity of voice and policy, because then you can crack on with the job. And this is about designing and delivering biodiversity net gain for the long term. But it's the clarity and the policy that comes through in the secondary legislation that's important. Next slide, please. The second point that I want to make to Defra, as we're working through this consultation and thinking about the secondary legislation and about biodiversity net gain, now is the time more than ever where we have to join the dots. And there's no more powerful place to join those dots than legislation. The first dot in my book is definitely biodiversity net gain. We need to get that right. And that comes back to that point about the clarity of what the ask is of legislation. And if we don't have that right, we are at risk of inconsistencies, of muddying the water with biodiversity net gain. So biodiversity net gain is the first dot, and we need to get that right. But it won't work if we think about biodiversity net gain in isolation. And while as a practitioner, there's some really interesting projects and works on the ground in terms of joining the dots between biodiversity net gain and other sustainability elements, we can only go so far. We always come up against that barrier if it's not there in legislation and it's not there in policy. So the second dot to join with biodiversity in my book is carbon. There's such a close interplay between biodiversity net gain and carbon net zero, where that must be joined and clearly joined in legislation. And the second dot is us, it's people, it's well-being. Already within planning policy talks about how development should consider the impacts on people's well-being. Well, if it's a development and biodiversity net gain, then what does that mean for considering the impacts on people's well-being? And that's particularly important because you can actually have a great biodiversity net gain project, but with devastating impacts on people, and that's not okay, and that's not sustainable development. But that will happen if we put biodiversity net gain in one box and treat it in isolation. So clarity and policy for the strength of wording about what the ask is for biodiversity net gain, then we will deliver that. But in legislation, that's the place where we need to start joining the dots. Next slide, please. And my final point is it's not about the 10%. And I work a lot with the metric, and I think metric 3 is great, and it's an improvement of version 2, certainly. Still a little bit of comments that I have about it, but it's certainly an improvement. But it's not just about this individual 10%, it's about all of those 10% within any one given landscape. It's really hard to do that, to pick up all the 10% when you're working on an individual project. You can try to make reference to other conservation work going on or other net gain projects, and if they get the register right, or the register of hopefully on and off-site biodiversity net gain, that will help as well. But legislation, that is the place to give us the umbrella where all of these 10% can work together. And then we know where we are on the map to getting to the ultimate goal of nature restoration. Now, I'm hoping, and there's a little bit in the consultation about nature recovery networks, which should be the place for this. So that's the ultimate strategy for nature recovery and nature restoration. So it's not enough in terms of the consultation and from what I'm seeing. And I think, again, it comes back to the clarity and getting biodiversity net gain right. But we need to think beyond each individual 10% and really push the boundaries with that. And also that enables us to think much more about the long-term principles and to think much more long-term as well. So it's these individual 10% and how they add up over the long term. Thank you.
Many thanks, Julia. Some really interesting food for thought already. I guess my first question to you is, you talked about joining the dots between carbon zero and biodiversity net gain. And we know that carbon gets an awful amount of attention, so it's great to have this session today emphasising the BNG aspect. But doesn't that all heap together? I know you said they're integral parts of each other, but doesn't that add up to an enormous burden on developers, almost prohibitively so? And how would you go about tackling that?
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. You know, if you're suddenly asking developers, well, now you've got biodiversity net gain and that's linked to carbon zero, and you've got to do all these new assessments. And believe you me, as a contractor, I know the joys of working with consultants. Um, the thing is, what I would say is that's the true cost of development. It's not that there hasn't been that cost, we just haven't accounted for it. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but the Earth is keeping score. The development that we have at the moment is minimizing damage. And just because we don't properly account for the cost doesn't mean that the Earth isn't taking the hit. It is. And now we have just uncovering the true cost of what we're doing. And so I think it is those honest takes on what is the true cost of development and really what does sustainable development look like. And then we get the opportunities. And the opportunities are nature-based solutions. So let's come up with that innovation about, okay, biodiversity net gain, what's the carbon impact? How does that link with carbon net zero? There's that initial startup cost, but then can we offset that cost with nature-based solutions? And that brings in the markets in a really exciting green way for green technologies. I think that will boost the offset market in a really positive way as well. So yes, I do appreciate that, and I hear that concern a lot from developers, but I think it's actually the true cost of what we're doing at the moment. And if we're clever, we will then springboard that into the right solutions.
Fantastic. I appreciate your optimism and energy. My final question to you at the moment is, you mentioned the offset markets. Obviously, this is a relatively new area. So how would you be able to pinpoint perhaps just the top most crucial factor in establishing that? What do people need to go to?
You know what, a lot of people, and rightly so, talk about enforcement and regulation. As in like the control, making sure it's done right. And I agree with that. But actually, enforcement and regulation is the go-to for giving buyers confidence. No one wants to buy into an offset market where they don't have confidence in who's selling the credits. And when you have a system that's really well regulated, that's really well set up, people are more likely to use it. So you're looking at good old-fashioned buyer confidence here. So enforcement and regulation, you get two for the price of one. You get if you get it right, you get the enforcement and regulation that we need to make sure that we're getting biodiversity net gain on the ground and delivered in the long term. But that's the springboard. That I think will really invigorate an interest in the offset markets, because people will be like, I can trust this. You know, again, it comes back to no one likes risk and uncertainty. And when you have a new market, they're like, oh, I'll just let someone else test that out. No. It's enforced, it's regulated, it gives buyer confidence, and that's what we need.
So people should see that as a help, not a hindrance. Great.
Exactly.
All right. Many thanks for your contribution today, and I'm sure people will have more questions for you later on. So now we'll go to John Davis, who is, as of 2020, a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. He's also the founder of RSK Wilding, and he is here to talk to us about the building blocks of biodiversity and piece and how they fit together. So nice to have you with us.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me. Could I have the first slide, please? And the next slide. Thank you. Practitioner's perspective. So we, as Caroline said, I set up Wilding a couple of years ago when the Environment Bill was first out, and the aim was really to tackle this specific BNG issue, because we could see what a big issue is going to be. So I'm part of the RSK Biocensus ecology team as well. So that's where I come from. I come from an ecology background. And we basically work with on the demand side. So that's with developers who will need biodiversity offsetting. So we'll write BNG reports for them. So that's identifying require associated with their development. And on the other side, on the supply side, we also work with landowners. So we might write feasibility studies or BNG delivery plans for them, which is essentially setting out what they would need to do on their land, what habitat restoration they would do, and what that would mean in terms of the number of biodiversity units they would be and what they would be able to sell. And we essentially bring these two together as a sort of a BNG Tinder, if you like. We are matchmaking developers and landowners. The fundamentals underpinning what we do, but we also work on larger off-scale, offsetting projects with people like Network Rail and National Grid, who have a lot of land where they could offset within their land ownership. So those sorts of projects are very interesting. And ultimately, we will be creating habitat banks ourselves, where we will be. So we do the kind of the whole thing for BNG, and therefore I think we've got a pretty good idea of what the Defra consultation needs to achieve. So if I can have the next slide. So there were basically 4 key areas, I think, in the consultation that I was most interested in. Julia's just touched on the regulation side of things, and that is really fundamental, that this is a really reliable process and people can trust it. So it's very important that sufficient funding, resources, especially within the LPAs. I note that committed to fully fund, is how they put it, so that hopefully they realize how much it's going to cost to provide the resources to make sure this is achieved, because there'll be a lot of money required for local authorities to review BNG reports and net gain site applications, and to keep the register going, and to enforce and to monitor all these things. It'll take an awful lot to make sure this works properly. I think it's also interesting that this resourcing might mean that the work is outsourced to people like us. So not only might we work with developers and landowners, but we might also help out advising local authorities. And there is a question, a kind of a conflict of interest question that needs to be asked there, and if we had a habitat bank in that area. But the corollary of that is that local authorities will probably have their own habitat banks, so there need to make sure they don't prioritize their own sites over others. It is already in the consultation that isn't going to be allowed. And then the final thing was about enforcement, which again Julia mentioned. We need to make sure there's teeth and there's a willingness to enforce it, and funding to enforce, otherwise the biodiversity gains that we are hoping will be achieved won't be achieved. Next slide, please. And so the next key issue I want to talk about was based on the that Julia mentioned, this kind of bigger, better, more joined up. So our tagline is bigger, better and wilder, but will it be? I think there is a risk through BNG that you might have a lot of itty bitty little bits of habitat created as offsetting on site, when in my mind the offsetting on larger landscape scale sites, ideally within local nature recovery strategy areas, so where the counties are identifying restoration is best placed, those will work better ecologically, in my opinion. Certainly people should be it's incentivized away from destroying habitat, so you keep habitat on site, but offsetting I think should be offsite, ideally in large projects. One of the things about the Defra consultation which I found interesting was it wouldn't necessarily have the same rules in these on-site offsetting than you have with the offsite. So will you still have the 30-year conservation covenants? Will you still be held to the same rigorous rules about monitoring and all the rest of it? That certainly needs to be the case, of course, because it's all achieving the biodiversity net gain that you're committing to. And then the last thing I think which is interesting is that we don't want offsetting that's done outside of these LNRSs to be the poor relation of habitat banks that are inside. We don't want to dissuade landowners that want to do the right thing but don't happen to be, within an LNRS. We don't want them to be dissuaded from doing so because they're penalised because they're not in an LNRS. Okay, next slide, please. So Julia talked about the market regulation, and that is also. So it's not just the LPAs and how that's going to be regulated that way, it's how the market will operate. And that picture kind of shows the maths. You turn a not very biodiverse habitat into something nice and you get some cash for it. That's kind of a fundamentals. What price to biodiversity unit? Well, there we go. That's $1 million request. It's anything from about £10,000 a unit to 100,000, depending where you are and what you're doing, which is a pretty massive difference. So there does need to be regulation of the market. And those are the 4 key things I've identified: the accountability, enforcement, and transparency. We need to be making sure that all of this, which will be a very large scale process, is delivering the biodiversity it's meant to. Because it's a new market, people will pile in. they'll see the opportunity, but we don't want it to be a license to print money without the biodiversity benefits. And that's why I think that accreditation is particularly important for anyone who is setting up habitat banks, giving advice to local authorities, working with a metric. They have to have suitable accreditation skills and expertise. Okay, final slide, please. And so the last thing is stacking, which again, I think Richard mentioned. So this is where you can get additional income from other natural capital benefits, not just your biodiversity offsetting, which I didn't think was going to be, but the consultation is suggesting it is. I think that's going to be good for farmers because it will make habitat restoration works more viable for them. They'll get more income because they won't just get the net gain income. They might be able to get money from water improvement measures or flood prevention measures, or people, all sorts of reasons, ways that you might get more money. But there is a risk, I think, that money will be then concentrated on smaller pockets of land than otherwise would be the case. So all the money is going to one farmer who's going to make a mint and won't be doing good work across the rest of the landscape. So plenty of work needs to be done on that. And then the last point, which is kind of related to stacking, is additionality. And that's where, again, I think Richard mentioned this, if you've got a triple SI, for example, it is meant to be kept at favourable conservation status. So BNG money shouldn't be paying for that to be done. Similarly, it was the case prior to the consultation that if you had work done for a European protected species license, so for bats, newts or dormice, the mitigation that you're doing for that couldn't count towards BNG, but that looks like that's changing. The Defra consultation is suggesting that all but maybe 10% could come from those activities. And that is very much up in the air, and I'd be interested to see how that pans out in the consultation. Okay, and that's me done.
Thanks, John. Just want to pick you up on one thing, which is you talked about the absolute imperative for accreditation if it's to avoid a huge Wild West out there. What will this accreditation involve exactly?
Well, most simply, it could be that our professional organisation, which is CIME, the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, which has a code of practice, you know, in order to be a member of CIME, you have to jump through various hoops and demonstrate how good you are as an ecologist and how professional you are. So that would be the easiest way to do it. But it's just, I don't, as long as only people who have proven expertise in this area are giving the advice. Otherwise, as I say, loads of people could just jump on the bandwagon and you get all sorts of cowboys. We mentioned the Wild West, so yeah, there we are. Cowboys could jump in and start
great,
you know, making income. Yeah.
Many thanks. Lovely.
Okay.
Well, our final speaker today is Dr. Indranil Ghosh. If I could invite him to come to the stage, please. Dr. Ghosh is the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of Tiger Hill Capital, which he also founded, which partners with leaders to build investment platforms, very much with an imperative for a societal impact mission. He is also an investor and strategic advisor to governments and leading corporations. So, Dr. Ghosh, delighted to have you with us. Can you give us your perspective on what this consultation will mean for future investment?
Well, thank you, Caroline. Maybe I can start just by putting biodiversity net gain and its opportunities in context with the broader sustainable investing movement. So, you know, about 12, 15 years ago, the amount of capital going into sustainable investing was practically zero. Today, if you look at how much money there is in managed investment funds out there, it's about 130 trillion. And out of that, 30 trillion is deployed in sustainable investing. So certainly there's been a big shift towards investing sustainably, you know, in the fund management industry. Now, where does that 30 trillion or 35 trillion actually get divided? Well, about 30 of it is going into ESG funds, which invest in Fortune 500 type public equities. And so this is really investing a lot of that capital into companies that are trying to score higher on ESG metrics, not necessarily all of them, having a huge E, S, or G impact, but perhaps being more socially responsible and having a slightly better footprint in terms of social responsibility metrics and environmental metrics. So there's some debate about how well that investment allocation is being deployed. But out of the 35 trillion, which is deployed in sustainable investing, about 5 trillion goes into more direct investments into renewable infrastructure, things like sustainable forestry, which is having a much more direct impact on the environment and society. But of that, very small amount goes into funding new companies in this sort of sustainability space. So that gives you a breakdown of how sustainable investing currently looks in terms of funds deployed and how it spreads out between public equities, something more relevant for net zero and biodiversity, which is infrastructure and sustainable funds. But then if we look even closer and we look at what's happened over the last 5 to 7 years, there's been actually quite a large increase in the amount of capital deployed into sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy, battery electric vehicles, energy storage, all of the things that you hear about when it comes to the energy transition. Today, this year, in fact, some of the largest infrastructure funds ever have been raised. So Brookfield raised a 27 billion fund for sustainable infrastructure, KKR another 17 billion. So the numbers are getting very large. But when you compare that with the size of funds you see for, let's say, sustainable forestry, the largest fund I'm aware of is about 7 or 8 billion. And the first regenerative farming fund is being raised by Goldman and targeting 1 billion. So if you look at how the trends progress, there is sort of a fight for capital to really mobilize behind an important sustainable trend. Energy transition, as I mentioned, has taken 5 to 7 years to sort of reach fund sizes which are of the magnitude I mentioned for Brookfield and KKR, and they are quite sizable. But when it comes to applications of nature-based solutions, which involve habitat restoration or stacking on top of that things like regenerative farming or even sort of renewable energy assets like wind and solar or vertical farming or manufacturing industry that uses natural materials, the amount of capital being deployed to that is really quite small at the moment. But I think will probably follow the same trend as the funds and capital that have flowed into energy transition. And I think we see nature-based solutions, especially with incentives like biodiversity net gain, as well as mechanisms like the voluntary carbon markets, really helping to incentivize investors to invest in those areas. And I think also biodiversity net gain credits offer a non-dilutive funding mechanism for smaller companies to begin to restore and improve land and begin to stack additional nature-based businesses on top of those, like the ones I mentioned, and therefore creating valuable assets and businesses in often rural areas that can have both a natural capital but also a social capital impact in terms of rejuvenating communities, creating jobs, and other factors that lead to more cohesive and sustainable society. So I think this is a very important opportunity. I think it will grow exponentially, like we've seen some of these other sustainability markets like energy transition infrastructure. And I think we're just at the cusp of this explosive investment trend.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Well, you've said trillions of dollars are involved, and it's only going to grow. Pretty mind-blowing. Based on this movement for so many years now and looking ahead, who would you say are already, I guess, the winners, and who are those with most to do to adapt? I'm talking broad brushstrokes. What parts of industry, what sectors have the most to do to adapt and to take advantage of this?
Well, if regenerative farming is a good analog, or some of the voluntary carbon market players are a good analog, then I think we're likely to see, very significant aggregation. So we'll see a few players becoming very, very large very quickly. So those investment platforms or companies that can actually have the capabilities to acquire large segments of land and then transform them for biodiversity, but also things like regenerative farming. The ones who have the capabilities will quickly be the ones who gather the most capital, build up further track record and gather more capital, and go into a cycle which propels them ahead of smaller competitors. So really, I think those will be the winners, and they'll be backed by the largest pension funds and capital providers, because they'll be offering a kind of exposure to net zero and biodiversity, which is going to be very difficult to get elsewhere, because a lot of the current opportunities in energy transition are net zero, whereas nature-based solutions can often be carbon negative or biodiversity net gain. So it'll be a unique, way of improving their sustainability metrics as investors. Where I think, there'll be more of a challenge is more sort of smaller scale, community scale development for biodiversity and, land restoration. That I think will need much, greater support from public and community organizations to sort of get off the ground. But I think there will probably be progress there as well. As we've seen in the energy space, again, there are very, very big, renewable energy facilities, but there's also rooftop solar, right, which can happen on a distributed local basis. So I'm sure the technology and the business models will emerge at that sort of local distributed level, but I think that's still in the works.
Okay, so it is big and small, but I guess what you're saying is fortune favours, well, the brave, but also people prepared to be pioneering in this area. Great. All right, well, many thanks, Indranil. We'll come back to you in a while. Right, so this is the exciting part where I have to press a big button. We've moved to a table discussion now. So this is the breakout session where you'll all be able to join your virtual themed tables. We have these 6 theme tables, as I said: residential development, commercial development, construction, transport, infrastructure, water. Maximum of 8 seats per table. If the table's full, jump to another one that most suits your requirements and interests. And the purpose of this session is to allow all of you to discuss the challenges, the opportunities, the comments, already things you've discovered are easy ways through navigating, but perhaps walls you've come up against, and what this policy will mean in your particular area of work. Each table is going to have an event assistant who will be making copious notes, and these will be shared at the end of the breakout session amongst the group as a whole, so we all benefit from the insight via this group chat function. 10 minutes before the end, big gong will go off, so you've got 10 minutes to go. Please take a moment to review these notes at this point, and then we'll come back to this presentation mode. Any questions? You've all been a little bit shy so far, but hopefully the discussion will inspire some interrogation of them. They're all experts in their fields, and we'll finish with a 50 Q&A. So I just have to press this big button now, so I hope this works. See you in 25 minutes. Welcome back. Thank you very much for taking the time to attend your tables and to contribute to your thoughts and comments. We've had plenty of feedback, all very interesting, and all clearly asking questions as much as asking comments. Oh, we just had the water table is coming in as well. So thank you for that. Right, so let's start. Let's work through the chat. If I can ask all of our speakers to turn their cameras and microphones on, so to come back to the stage. And we've got questions for all of you. And also don't forget, you can also send through in any specific questions via the Q&A button. Speakers, and I should stress, they have said anything they can't get to or feel is too involved, they'll be in touch with you direct. Right, so let's kick off the general chat. Where shall I start? Goodness. All right. Should we start with energy? Sorry, I've got too many buttons. Please. Right. Okay. Here we go. Yes. So starting with the energy table 2, got 2 key points. So you're asking, first of all, better to do a bigger improvement off-site rather than a disconnected one close to site, funding a project that also factors in carbon sequestration and flood prevention along with biodiversity net gain. John Davis, I think that sounds like one for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my bugbears, is that I do want this done on bigger projects. I don't think we want to completely discourage stuff being done on smaller sites and locally, because that does provide opportunities for local people to have access to wild places. I just think ecologically it works better. You know, ecosystem processes can kind of take over when you've got a large area of land. I'm very keen to do those big projects close to towns so that people can readily get to them. One of my issues with NEP, much as I love NEP, is it's very middle class and it's miles away, a long way to get there, and then it costs a fortune to camp there. So we want to get as many people interested in biodiversity as possible. So I think offsetting sites near to towns is a good idea. The second part of that is quite a different question, I think. But I do absolutely think that carbon sequestration, flood prevention, water quality improvement, all of these things, you know, there's a great opportunity here, not just to have biodiversity net gain and it to be just about biodiversity. I think Julia talked about this, but there are all sorts of other benefits. So the better that biodiversity offsetting for development is done, can bring into the piece all of these different benefits. And that, in fact, as an ecologist, it's rather wonderful to think that stuff that we are through BNG, which is an ecological thing, is having all sorts of other environmental benefits. That answers the question.
Thank you for that. The second point being made by the energy table is the importance for a company to have control over how these biodiversity improvements are implemented, and that there is cooperation between clients and consultants on how to achieve these ends. I think, Julia, you have touched on this before. What would you say about that? Would you agree about the importance of those relationships?
Absolutely, but as a contractor, I always say, don't forget about us. You know, we're the ones who build this, so it's client, consultant, and contractor. You know, I work on so many projects, and if we're not brought in early enough, things really break down, because we can see how to build things on the ground. And I talk to my engineers, and okay, they can see how you build the engineering aspects on the ground, but we have that buildability expertise, and we know how this will work when you get on the ground. I think, and we were just talking about it in the break, actually, I think this is a really interesting point about genuine collaboration. Because biodiversity net gain is such a team sport. It involves engineers, it involves the designers, it's not just the job of the ecologist to get it right all the way through. And it does start off with that vision by the client, building, you know, the housing project or the rail project or the power project with measurable improvements for biodiversity. So what's that vision? Then everyone plays their part in coming along with it. But it's also, if we come in and we build something and then we're going to hand over to maintainer, that relationship then continues as well. So collaboration, yes, the importance of the handover, we can get much better at that as we do from the start. And as a contractor, I'm going to say, don't forget about us.
There we go. Great. Okay. I think this leads us into some points being made by the water table. So some key challenges that they have identified first of all. So the skepticism of farmers and long-term payments hard for them. I guess this is a particularly a niche challenge that farmers have talked about for a long time, but perhaps if we can, I think with John struggling. So Richard, if you could just pick this up for me. But let's talk about farmers, but also for other people about skepticism that this will be of benefit and how you overcome that. So let's not forget the farmers, but also make it relevant for the group.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's skepticism from farmers because, you know, they're used to having schemes to do certain things for for biodiversity on their land, and there's been teething problems with those schemes, issues with them. I mean, these agreements need to be around for 30 years from the completion of development, so they're very long term. And whilst they may be achieved through a condition in the planning permission or through a Section 106 agreement, which we're familiar with, they may also largely be delivered through conservation covenants, which is a brand new mechanism, legal tool, coming into law for the first time under the Environment Act. And that's, no one really knows how they'll operate. Now, I think I worked with the Law Commission on the creation of conservation covenants as an idea, and then with Defra on their inclusion in the Environment Act. I think they are a good idea. I think they're a good legal tool. I think the novelty is that they will require positive covenants along with the land as well as negative ones. That's where you have to actually physically do things, which is why they're so useful for biodiversity net gain. Now, how they will be enforced will largely depend upon the responsible bodies who are on the other side of these conservation covenants, and that will be local authorities, but it may be, the local wildlife trust or the RSPB or Natural England or, other bodies. And the compliance and enforcement side of this, and therefore, making sure people get paid and things get delivered, and that's going to be, if the medium of that is conservation covenants, a lot of that will depend upon what the responsible bodies put into it, and how resourced they are to police them and make sure they work effectively.
I think
Okay,
if I could,
thank you.
If I could chip in, people hear me still?
Yep. Yes.
Sorry, if we were a bank, then we would be holding the money that comes from the developers are paying and be using that over 30 years to pay the landowner every year per hectare for what he's creating, to pay for monitoring and all of that stuff. So that's how it would be established, and we would be signing up to that through the covenant. So that would be our responsibility. So I think if farmers are concerned, they shouldn't be, because they'll have kind of a set amount of payment per hectare for 30 years. So it's quite a long-term commitment, and they don't really have to do an awful lot for it generally. So I don't think they should be too worried.
Okay, and also the water table made the same point. I think Julia touched on this earlier about companies wanting to do the right thing, but trying to make it work within a regulated environment. So Julia, I mean, you stressed the opportunity that came with a robust framework rather than seeing it as a hindrance. Would you expand on that? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, people always think about, the enforcement and getting the police out there and everything, but actually we really need to build confidence in the system. I mean, we've all talked today about the lack of clarity, the fact that we got an entire afternoon talking about what's going to happen, that tells you everything about the importance of the clarity of the answers, but also we need to build confidence for this going to work. We really do, because at the end of the day, myself, my colleagues working in consultancies and other contractors, we have a client, and their confidence and their trust in this is what's really going to make it happen.
Okay, thank you. Now this is a biggie. John, this is going to be familiar to you. The energy table has mentioned straight away challenges with the calculator. Do you have any solutions to this confusion and challenge?
Well, I'm not sure if
no solution.
There are issues. There are issues with the calculator, and it does kind of could steer towards habitats that get you the most bang for your buck in the metric, so you score better through the metric, but they might not be appropriate to that location particularly. So there's something called other neutral grassland is one of the habitats that scores very well in the metric. And if we're not careful, we could end up with the whole of the country covered in other neutral grassland because everyone's using it. So I think the regulation that needs to be done by the local authority ecologist and by Natural England needs to govern this to a degree and make sure that when people are creating habitats as part of net gain, that they're creating the right habitat in the right place, and they're not just doing it because they get more units from it. So there's a degree of regulation along with the metric. Don't forget that the metric is just a tool. It's advisory. It's there to help. It doesn't tell you exactly what you have to do, and local authorities do have the wherewithal to decide what is done.
Okay, Pretty wide-ranging question here again from the Energy about a concern with long-term commitment funding and responsibility, I guess, on the part of the corporations. Richard, would you like to pick that up? Are these valid concerns?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is that these habitat enhancements must be legally secured, you know, using those mechanisms, and that's vital in order for biodiversity accepted. So that's that legal sort of bite to it is what's is going to make sure that these commitments get fulfilled. Now, of course, how that works in practice, who polices that, how is that funded? You know, those questions are obviously unknown at the moment, but that's why there's a premium on making sure that they're legally secured.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, and I think we may lose Julia pretty soon, so I'm going to address this one for you, Julia. Somebody has picked up your 3 dots. It's quite a striking image, and Graham Campbell is asking, does the opportunity for stacking really look to recognise and draw out the opportunity of multiple benefits of nature-based solutions and connect more than 3 dots potentially?
Yeah, I was actually hoping that someone would say that there's loads of dots out there, and that's the thing, isn't it? You know, it is now about really breaking from the silos and joining as many dots as we can. I think before we get to stacking, there's the question about, well, what are the negative impacts of biodiversity net gain, particularly carbon? Generally, when we do biodiversity net gain, we avoid and we minimize habitat clearance, and then there's habitat clearance. So you have a deficit of biodiversity and you have a deficit of carbon. I don't see that deficit of carbon measured. I see people look at the planting habitats to get to net gain and think, oh, we got all these carbon credits. Have you? But what about this deficit here? So there's work to do to establish the true impacts of biodiversity net gain on its own. And then the stacking, I think stacking is really interesting, and I'm so glad and excited that it's featured in the consultation, what we have. But again, how many questions about, you know, what's it truly going to mean? And that's when I switched from enforcement for being something exciting to enforcement for being absolutely necessary, because it could be quite easy to fudge the system, or particularly if they talked about in the consultation that developers, if they have extra biodiversity units from the 10%, they can sell them. Exactly how is that going to work? So that's when I equally love enforcement, but for the right reasons in terms of enforcement. So stacking, yes, but it starts off with what the true negative impacts before we get to that. And yes, I'm sorry, I do have to go, but it's been fantastic to join everyone this afternoon.
Many thanks, Julia. Well, I think for each of you, we're squeezed for time. So obviously there's so much to discuss. Fear not, your questions and comments are all going into the report and will be picked up. And so it was worthwhile. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your comments, but they will be appearing in the on the website and in the report. And I'm going to finish by asking, I think we look as though we have 1.5 speakers. What would be your one suggestion, your one bit of feedback to take back to Defra before the consultation finishes? What would you say? Richard, let's start with you.
Oh, well, obviously more detail and get it out sooner rather than later. That's what I'm after, about all of these unanswered questions at the moment. But what Julie was just saying, particularly on the stacking point, because this is complex as it is, and that would put another layer of complexity on top of it. I think it's something that should happen, but it's
okay.
How that's going to work in practice is important.
More detail, please. What about you, John?
Quite a big answer, not a long one, don't panic, which is the regulation and the funding just needs to be sorted, because this needs to be something that is did by people, so that it needs to be well designed, it needs to be clear, as Julia said, it needs to be fair, it needs to be transparent, and there will need to be money from government to local authorities and others, helping the market to regulate itself, helping local authority regulate people doing this. So that's
Okay.
where this could all fall down if we're not careful.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I think the big takeaway from today is that it's a huge story, massive impact on each of your industries, trillions of dollars already being invested. We heard from Indranil, it's only growing. Those already participating will be the long-term beneficiaries, although it will take courage and vision and collaboration. There are lots of unknowns about how any of this legislation is going to take force in real life practice. But clearly, as Richard just said, and John backed up, the devil is in the detail. But for each of you who wants to benefit from this, as Julia said, she urged everyone to contribute to the consultation. It closes on the 5th of April, so you have just over a fortnight. It's on the Defra website, and they are wanting to hear from you. So that is, I think, the message of today. Right, thank you so much for coming along to this Remo world, but I hope it's been valuable. There is the feedback survey sent to you to feedback the good, the bad, and what can be improved and how it can help you further. The article will be on the RSK website, which will be sent to all the attendees once it's published. And I think to keep this network open for another 30 minutes so you can all network. The next one of these seminars is on the 12th of May, talking about the Global Biodiversity Framework, and the story will continue. So 30 minutes more. It just remains me to thank everyone for coming today, and to thank our speakers, and to wish you all a very good afternoon.